Okay, so talking about the digestive system. This is a pretty big packet. I know it's not significantly long as far as numbers of pages go, but there's a lot of organs, okay? And the main organs of our digestive system form a tube that goes all the way through our thoracic abdominal pelvic cavities. We call this tube our gastrointestinal tract, or GI tract for short. You'll also hear it described as an alimentary canal. You'll never hear me call it that, but that's another term for it. This extends from your mouth to the anus and includes the mouth, the pharynx, which we just talked about in our last lecture, that fancy word for our throat, the esophagus, the stomach, as well as the small intestine and your large intestine. Those are not the only structures that make up your digestive system. You also got accessory organs that don't perform any digestion or absorption, but assist in the processes. They include your teeth, your tongue, and your salivary glands. All those are associated with the mouth, as well as the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, which produce fluids that help with digestion. If you look down here at the bottom of the page, you notice here on the left side, there's a lot of things labeled, some of which are colored red, some of which are colored black. I'm guessing they use black to denote the tract, whereas red would be those accessory organs. And we'll be getting into all of those. Okay. As a whole, your tract is super long. It's approximately 5 to 7 meters or 16.5 to 23 feet in length. And obviously that means it's not just a straight shot from mouth to your butt. It's not a straight tube by any means, especially when you get to your intestines. The small intestines, which make up a big portion of the tract, are very long and very twisted. Same thing goes for your large intestine as well. Now, notice here it says that this is the length in a living person. The term living person sounds kind of weird, because why would we care what happens to us when we die? But just kind of food for your thought. Your tract would actually extend and get longer after you die, and that's because the muscle that's in the walls of the tract relax, and so it's able to expand a little bit, but not really that important to know. Embryologically, this tract forms from a tube-like structure that then develops outpouchings, and those outpouchings evolve into the attached digestive organs, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, etc. Throughout the tract, there are storage sites, excretion sites, and detoxifying sites. When food is passing through the lumen, or the internal cavity of the tract, it's not technically entering your body until it's absorbed through the walls of the tract, where it then passes into the blood or your lymphatic vessels. So if you had lunch just before class, like I did, more than likely that food is mixing around in your stomach. So it's inside of us, but technically it's still considered outside of us, which sounds really weird, but only when it's able to be broken down to the point where it can go through the walls and into the bloodstream or into the lymph, then it truly is inside of us. Okay. Functions of the digestive system include the transportation of food and water and the modifying of that food and water to make them suitable for absorption and excretion. Speaking of things like that, let's talk about the different treatment processes of food we do in the digestive system. Begins with the process of eating, ingestion. So taking a bite, chewing it up, and then swallowing. And swallowing pushes that food down into your stomach, which is an example of propulsion, the movement of food along the GI tract. Now, there's two forms of movement that take place in the tract, what we call peristalsis and then segmentation. Peristalsis is a series of alternating contractions and relaxations through muscle, lining the walls of our digestive organs. And the key with propulsion is it forces food to move forward only. And this is the major means of moving the food through the tract. Okay. Well, in the case of segmentation, it actually pushes food backward and forward. And so it kind of swirls stuff around and helps break it down, which I'll get to in a second. Going back to our mouth, when we bring that food into our mouth, we expose it to our first fluid, which is saliva. Okay. And saliva is secreted. We secrete a lot of things. Secretion is the production and release from a cell or gland of a physiologically active substance. Okay. Not only are we secreting saliva, but in the esophagus, we're secreting mucus to lubricate the food so that it's much more easily swallowed. And then down in our stomach and our intestines, we're dumping all sorts of different chemicals in there to digest our food. And we'll get into all that later on. Now, speaking of digestion, There's two forms of it, mechanical and chemical. Mechanical is a physical breakdown of the food into smaller pieces. So it's like chopping up something from big to small. Begins with chewing of our food. We take a bite out of something. We're not like Scooby-Doo and Shaggy where we can swallow the whole sandwich. We've got to take small bites out of it. Continues with the muscular churning of the stomach. And in our small intestine, especially, we perform a lot of segmentation. Okay? And that's, once again, the other form of muscular contraction and movement in the wall. It's similar to peristalsis, except the rhythmic timing of the muscle contractions moves food forward and backward rather than just forward only. So we're pushing stuff in both directions, and that helps chop it up into smaller pieces. Chemical digestion is a lot more complicated because this is like chemistry. We're talking about breaking chemical bonds. It uses enzymes. A process called hydrolysis is what that is known as, where we're going from something bigger to something smaller. And these are typically going to be taking place in the stomach and small intestines. And the whole reason that we eat and drink, aside from just being hungry and thirsty, which is, you know, kind of the basic desire, it's to get the stuff into our body that we don't produce. And we're not able to produce our own food like plants, which use photosynthesis to get their own food and energy. We have to bring it in by eating, and we have to do the same thing by breathing. So we just got done talking about breathing and the respiratory system. Now we talk about something else that we bring into our body, things like water, carbohydrates, and proteins, and lipids, and vitamins, and minerals. And that leads us to absorption, the movement of those different things from the tract to adjacent blood and lymphatic vessels, which can be either done through passive diffusion or active transport. Doesn't really matter. We don't talk about that in this class. Now, we don't absorb everything that's in our tract. What's left is undigested material, can be waste products, can be stuff that we just didn't get a chance to absorb because it was moved too quickly. And that's what we push out through the process of defecation through the anus, what we would commonly call our poo, okay? Looking at the illustration on the left, it's not something I'm going to ask you to know. What we're going to do is just kind of focus in on each individual part. We'll start at the mouth and work our way eventually down to the anus. Over on the right is a picture of a cadaver's abdomen with the skin and the muscles of the abs on. So we can see internally the very numerous organs that we'll be talking about from that area, the big liver. We can see a little bit of the stomach. We see the small intestines very nicely. All the things that are labeled with colon are part of the large intestine. And we'll get into all that here in a little bit. But first, let's just talk about the tube, the tract as a whole, and its kind of structural makeup. As previously stated, the GI tract is simply a complex tube from one end of the body to another, from the mouth to the anus. From the lower part of your esophagus all the way to the anal canal, there is the same basic four-layered arrangement of tissues. Okay, so essentially from here on down to here, it's the same four layers: mucosa, submucosa, then you got the muscularis, and then on the outside is the serosa. Well, obviously, the tract doesn't begin at the end of your esophagus. It begins at the mouth. And then you got the pharynx and then the upper and the middle parts of the esophagus. So does that mean that those structures don't have those layers? They will have some. They don't have necessarily all of them, but they will at least, definitely, they're going to have a mucosa, okay? Mucosa is the mucous membrane lining the inside of those organs. And your mouth all the way to the anus has it. So all of the organs of the tract have the mucosa. Looking down at the bottom, we see that the mucosa is actually 3 layers thick. A very thin inner lining, which is the epithelium, surrounded by a thicker lamina propria, and then surrounding that is a layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis mucosae. Let's talk a little bit about each of those layers. The epithelium in the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus, as well as the anal canal, is made up of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, which serves as a protective function. So it's many layers, and there's no keratin, and the cells are flat and plate-like. Okay. You're also going to find simple columnar epithelium, which functions in secretion and absorption, which is going to be found in the stomach and the intestines. Okay. So both the small and the large. Located among those epithelial cells are going to be exocrine cells that secrete mucus and fluid into the lumen of the canal, as well as several types of endocrine cells known as enteroendocrine cells that secrete hormones. So with regard to the exocrine cells, they're going to be dumping secretions into the lumen, into the hollow space, whether that's the stomach, whether that's the intestines, whether it's back up in the mouth. That's what those exocrine cells are doing. Okay? There's also those endocrine cells, which secrete hormones, and we'll look at some of those hormones, not very many of them, not in this class anyway, but those are going to be hormones that have a lot to do with regulating aspects of digestion. Surrounding that inner epithelium is the lamina propria, which is areolar connective tissue, where you find lots of blood and lymphatic vessels, although they're not shown. These are very important because these are the routes by which nutrients are absorbed from the canal. So in other words, this is where the stuff that we absorb ends up going into the blood, into the lymph. If it's fat, that's where we absorb fat. That's what we've talked before. This is also going to be where you find a majority of the cells of the mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT for short, like the Peyer's patches. You guys remember talking about those just a week or so ago? Those are nodules that provide protection against diseases. We can see those actually labeled here in the picture, colored green, just like we always use for the lymphatic system. Okay. They're present all along the canal, especially in the tonsils, the small intestine, appendix, and your large intestines. Okay. Then the muscularis mucosae is going to help throw the mucous membrane of the stomach and small intestine into many small folds, which increases their surface area, making them better at digesting and absorbing. Movement of muscle here ensures that all absorptive cells are fully exposed to the food in the canal. Overall, we can say the functions of the mucosa include the secretion of mucus, digestive enzymes, hormones, absorption of the end products of digestion into the blood, and protection against infectious disease. Submucosa is the layer surrounding the mucosa, made up of areolar connective tissue. We're going to find a significant number of blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, as well as lymph nodes and nerve fibers. You'll find glands here as well, just like there were glands in the mucosa. And these glands will connect to the lumen of the, whatever it is, stomach or intestines or whatever. Okay? And regulating the secretion of those glands is a network of neurons called the submucosal plexus that's associated with the submucosa, hence the name submucosal plexus. So in other words, these are the neurons that tell the submucosa's glands to secrete, because we're not always just dumping fluids into the stomach, not always doing that in the small and large intestines either, only when, like food's in there to be digested. Okay? Now, you don't want to confuse the submucosal plexus with the myenteric plexus, which is another network of neurons, except it's associated with the muscularis. Okay? And guess what's making up the muscularis? Muscle. Okay? But what type and how much is dependent upon where you're at in the tract. In the mouth and the pharynx, it's made up of skeletal muscle, which is voluntarily controlled and very important for swallowing. Whereas pretty much everywhere else, it's smooth muscle. Okay? And that includes the stomach, which actually has 3 layers. And then 2 layers are found in the small and the large intestines. Okay? Controlling their contraction and relaxation is that myenteric plexus. And then finally on the outside is the serosa, serous membrane, composed of areolar connective tissue covered with a layer of simple squamous epithelium called mesothelium. It's not labeled as that, but that's what you see down here in the picture. Okay. The serosa is also called the visceral peritoneum because it forms a portion of your peritoneum. There's that other double membrane that we introduced at the very beginning of the semester, similar to the pleura that we just talked about few minutes ago around the lungs, just like the pericardium that surrounds the heart. In the case of the esophagus, it actually lacks the serosa and instead just contains that single layer of areolar connective tissue called the adventitia. Now, looking at this illustration at the bottom, this is just kind of showing you those 4 layers. Once again, you're going to find this your stomach, your large intestine, then some of those will be in like the mouth, the pharynx, and the esophagus. I do want you to highlight some stuff, not everything in this picture. So here's what you'll want to know. Starting on the top left or top here, I'll start with the submucosal plexus. Don't worry about the other term, plexus of Meissner is not important. And then I'm going to go counterclockwise over here to lumen. So it's important to understand what's the inside of the organ. Then you need to know the mucosa and its 3 layers. The submucosa, the muscularis and their 2 layers, circular is on the inside, longitudinal is on the outside. And then the serosa with its 2 layers, and the myenteric plexus, just like the submucosal plexus. You don't need to know about the other kind of fancier name. Now, I just said I could tell you that this is the small intestine, and then there's a couple of reasons why. The shape is a kind of dead giveaway. But also, it's the presence of this structure here that's labeled as the mesentery. And we're going to talk about that here on this next page. That mesentery is a structure associated with this peritoneum that I was just mentioning. Peritoneum is the largest of our 3 serous membranes of the body. Consists of a layer of simple squamous epithelium, known as mesothelium, and an underlying layer of areolar connective tissue. So it's just what we talked about on the previous page with the serosa. Okay. Now, just like the pericardium and the pleura that surround your heart and your lungs, there's 2 layers to this peritoneum, a parietal and a visceral peritoneum. Parietal peritoneum is what lines the abdominal pelvic cavity, whereas the visceral peritoneum covers some of the organs in the cavity and is their serosa. So it's their outer layer. Next week, when we get to dissect the cats, we're going to open up their chest and their abdomen doing what I always just call a zipper cut. So it's basically just a cut straight down their chest and abdomen like you do like when you unzip your jacket. Okay? And once we get that chest and abdomen open, we'll make some sideways cuts so that we can then just like, when you open up the coat, that's what we're going to be able to do so we can see like the lungs and the intestines and liver and whatnot. Okay. What you're going to see on the inner lining of those flaps that we open up is a shiny membrane. Okay. That's what the parietal peritoneum is. Okay. If I go back to this picture, you can kind of see it. They've actually just kind of removed all of it. But if you kind of look on this like side wall over here or over here, you can kind of see where that would be at. Okay. Now, the visceral peritoneum covers some of the organs. Okay. And this peritoneal layer is pretty far back in the abdomen. And so you have to actually like move out a lot of the organs like the small and the large intestine because they're just kind of covering it up. Because they're found in the peritoneal cavity, which is the space between those 2 layers, full of a fluid called peritoneal fluid that helps lubricate and allow those organs to slip and slide over one another. But some of the organs lie behind the visceral peritoneum and thus are not inside of that peritoneal cavity. We call these organs retroperitoneal for that reason, which means behind peritoneum. Okay. They're going to be the organs that have a really shiny membrane covering them. That's that visceral peritoneum. And next week, I'll point it out to you. Your kidneys are a great example of retroperitoneal organs because they got that shiny membrane covering them, and then there's really far back in the abdomen. Okay. Other organs that are considered to be retroperitoneal include the ascending and descending large intestine, the duodenum, and the pancreas. Okay. Like I said, we'll get into seeing those next week. Okay. Now, unlike the pericardium and the pleurae that cover the heart and lungs, peritoneum has large folds that weave between the viscera of the organs, binding them to one another and to the walls of the abdominal cavity. This is also going to be where you find some blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves that supply these organs. There are 5 major peritoneal folds, and they include this yellow, gross-looking one that we can see here on the right, as well as here on the bottom left. And this is called the greater omentum. It's a really gross-looking structure. You'll see it in the cats next week. It is a fatty apron, essentially, that covers your intestines. Okay? It drapes over the transverse colon and coils of the small intestine like that fatty apron. Happens to be a double sheet folding back on itself. And I call it a fatty apron because it's got a lot of fat tissue, a lot of adipose tissue. And unfortunately, this is the tissue that can greatly expand with weight gain, giving rise to that characteristic beer belly. Okay? So in this case, this abdomen, these organs are covered up by that greater omentum. But if I go back to the first page, it's been removed. And that's going to be one of the first things we do once we get the cats open, is just get that nastiness out of there because it's just going to be in the way. The next fold of the peritoneum is the falciform ligament. You can see it labeled right here in that picture. We can also see it here. You can see it right here. It's this white membrane in the middle of the body, separating the liver into its right and left lobes. And now you'll notice there's very unequal lobe sizes to the liver. The right lobe is significantly bigger than the left lobe. But the falciform ligament is what separates those two from one another. So we'll talk a little bit more about it when we get to the liver later in the lecture. Okay, not to be confused with the greater omentum. The lesser omentum is an anterior fold in the cirrhosis of the stomach and duodenum, and it suspends them from the liver. We can see it both here and here. This is an image where you can see the stomach very nicely in the lesser omentum. This is where the liver is kind of lifted upwards, and we get kind of a little better view of it, I would say, to show it off. Over on the bottom right is going to give you a view of the mesocolon and the mesentery, which are the last two. Let's talk about the mesentery first. It's a fan-shaped fold of the peritoneum binding the jejunum and the ileum, the small intestine, to the posterior abdominal wall. It's kind of a shiny, clear membrane. And next week, when we're opening up the cats and we're kind of rooting around in there, you'll be able to kind of pull on the small intestines, but not be able to pull them out of the belly because they're attached. And that attachment is through this mesentery, and I'll make sure you get to see that. Similar to that is the mesocolon. Once again, colon always tells you we're talking about the large intestine. So this is 2 separate folds of the peritoneum binding the transverse and the sigmoid colon of the large intestine. Okay. And if we could jump to the very back of the lecture, here we have essentially isolated large intestine. It would be kind of in this space like so. We have some models that'll show it off next week. We'll look at those in lab as well. As far as the pictures on this page, you don't need to worry about any of them, so don't study them. Just make sure you know the information. Any questions here?